Hello everyone, this is APUSH review for time period 1945 to 1980. This is your post-World War II era. And there's many different ways we can review this time period. We could go president by president. We could go decade by decade. We could go thematically. So I'm probably going to bounce a little bit around here. And remember, you do have notes in all of the lessons that we went over in class. So, for this time period, let's see what they are referring to. After World War II, the U.S. is grappling with prosperity and unfamiliar international responsibilities while struggling to live up to its ideals. I think the best themes to recall here are that the economy in the 50s and 60s was strong, but then stumbled in the 70s, only to bounce back in the 80s. You could also look at the fight for equality for women, for African Americans, for actually many other groups. And you could think about the Cold War as the dominant foreign policy of the era. Presidents in order are here. We go from Truman to Eisenhower, Truman a Democrat, Eisenhower Republican. Then the 60s, we have Kennedy and Johnson after Kennedy's assassination, both Democrats. And then at the end of the 60s, we changed to a Republican with Richard Nixon, who was elected in 1968, remember, defeating Pegasus and other people such as Hubert H. Humphrey. And Ford and Carter struggle in the 70s to achieve success in their administrations, somewhat because of the difficult economy. If we want to review the civil rights movement yet again, obviously we've gone through so many different events. I just highlighted some major ones here. Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. That is the case that ended segregation in schools. Many people will say that this overturned Plessy versus Ferguson, the 1896 Supreme Court case that said segregation was legal as long as the facilities were separate but equal. In 1955, the Montgomery bus boycott was organized by a young Martin Luther King with the help of Rosa Parks, who refused to give up her seat on a bus. Remember, though, Claudette Colvin was probably going to be the person who started this movement, but when she got pregnant, they didn't think she would be a good image for the struggle. Also remember that some might say the case of Browder versus Gale actually overturned Plessy, because in this case, segregation on buses was declared unconstitutional, and since Homer Plessy was trying to ride a train, they're both modes of transportation. 1957, Little Rock 9 were chosen to be the first to integrate that school, but the governor, Orville Faubus, refuses to allow them to enter, calls in the National Guard to prevent them, but then Eisenhower takes the military under his command and forces the integration of this school. Sorry about that. But Faubus just simply then closed down the school for everybody the following year. 1960, JFK is elected, somewhat with the help of the black vote, Martin Luther King gathering more votes for him. 1964 is the most significant Civil Rights Act possibly of that time period. LBJ worked tirelessly to get votes on both sides of the aisle, and 1 year later the Voting Rights Act was passed that some of us know has been weakened since that time in 2013. The Watts riots in 1965, just one example of the urban riots that took place during this era. And the Southern strategy is when Republicans, trying to gain more votes from the South, which had been Democratic for a very long time, used states' rights as the platform. Behind that, they were probably trying to court white Southern racist votes, people who were upset with the progress of the Civil Rights Movement. All right, Cold War. The policy of the United States during this Cold War struggle is containment. We're trying to stop the spread of communism. And George Kennan was the architect of this plan, although working in the State Department and working in the Soviet Union, he wasn't particularly happy with the way that we went about trying to contain. He thought it should have been more economic in nature and not as much on the battlefield. I'm assuming everybody knows that the Cold War is an ideological struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union. Truman Doctrine is when we provided aid to Greece and Turkey. When we took the practice test today, I did notice some people answered that question incorrectly, and I was a little surprised. I'm going to have to ask you in class. The Truman Doctrine is simply a containment strategy. So once you saw that, I would think that that initially would have been the answer, but it was also comparing Truman with Reagan. And remember, at the end of the Cold War, Reagan is also still fighting against communism. Truman Doctrine does succeed. These countries don't turn communist, and the Marshall Plan is a package of $12 billion in aid that's offered to all European countries, again, as long as they prevent communism. Berlin was divided after the World War II, and the Soviets had one section, the Allies had another. They also divided East and West Germany, but Berlin was inside of the entire communist section of East Germany. Soviets tried to blockade that part of Berlin, and the Allies came in with one of the greatest humanitarian relief efforts ever with the Berlin airlift. The world is going to become increasingly divided. NATO will be the U.S. allies, formed in 1949, and the Warsaw Pact will be the Soviet allies. 1950, there will be a UN military police action with the Korean War, and this is due to the North Koreans invading South Korea. North Korea was the communist side, and the Soviet Union had been boycotting the UN at this time due to the UN's not recognizing the newly formed communist government in China. I know some of you have been watching House of Cards, and I will probably tell you about that whole season 3 situation later on. And remember, this is the war when Truman fires MacArthur wanting to attack China after he was pushed back at the border, and Truman refuses to expand the war. On the home front, there is a second Red Scare. We create HUAC, House Un-American Activities Committee, to try to root out any communists in the government. We even pass an act that requires groups to register with the government, the McCarran Internal Security Act. There are some espionage cases, most famous one of the Rosenbergs, who were both executed for giving atomic secrets to the Soviets. Joseph McCarthy was a senator who said he had a list of people in the government, 205 individuals who were communists, but never came up with any names. He was discredited. During Eisenhower's time, Sputnik, Soviets got into space before us. We responded to that with more money into math and science education. And the U-2 incident, we had a plane flying over the Soviet Union. We were also getting ready for a peace conference with them in Geneva. That conference was canceled when they shot down our plane. We said it was just checking the weather, but the Soviets thought otherwise. And in Eisenhower's farewell address, he warned us against the growing military-industrial complex. Please do not go to war for simply getting businesses rich and profiteering. All right, Cold War continued. Now we go to the 60s and 70s. Under JFK, there was an attempt to overthrow Castro in the Bay of Pigs invasion, but it failed when he called off the air cover at the last minute. Cuban Missile Crisis, the world waited on the edge as the Soviet Union and the U.S. nearly came to nuclear war because of Cuba. Soviets building missile silos on the island, 90 miles away from Florida, and the U.S. under JFK setting up a quarantine of the island to prevent the missiles from getting through. 64 to 75 is the Vietnam War. We began our involvement after the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Now this is LBJ. And 2 U.S. ships, the Sea Turner Joy and the Maddox, were allegedly attacked off the coast of Vietnam. We're not really sure if this happened or not, but only 2 congressmen voted against the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, Ernest Gruning and Wayne Morse. The country gets increasingly divided between hawks, who are in favor of the war, and doves. Turning point is 1968, beginning of the year. U.S. was surprise attacked by the North Vietnamese on their Vietnamese New Year. This is the Tet Offensive. But even though it wasn't a terrible military defeat, the United States was impacted as it was on TV as the first televised war. Chicago Democratic Convention. I've said this so many different times, all the protesters and Pegasus, and this really leads to Nixon benefiting from the disarray in the chaos within the Democratic Party. Nixon decides he wants to remove the troops from Vietnam, Vietnamization, but secretly is bombing Cambodia. When news of that reached the public, there was a protest in Ohio, Kent State. 4 students were killed during a protest on the campus. And then also during Nixon's presidency, we heard news of a My Lai massacre in which U.S. troops, struggling to figure out who the enemy was, massacred a village of innocent people, many women and children. And the Pentagon Papers, they were leaked by Daniel Ellsberg. This was a document, I think it may have been about 7,000 pages, that was chronicling U.S. policy in Vietnam from Truman all the way to Nixon, although Nixon had just become president, so it was mostly up to LBJ. Nixon didn't want this released, but the Supreme Court said the New York Times had the right to do so. And while the Gulf of Tonkin resolution increases the power of the president to use troops, the War Powers Act will decrease it. Now the president can only use troops for 60 days without Congress's authority. If they do not give it to him, then he must remove the troops within 30 days. We continue with Nixon, and détente was a relaxation of Cold War tensions. Remember, Nixon was the first president to visit communist China and was trying to cool off the Cold War conflict. After Nixon is Ford, and then after Ford is Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter arranged the Camp David Accords, peace agreement between Egypt and Israel, although not much of a lasting peace since the Egyptian leader was killed 1 year later by his own people. Panama Canal, Jimmy Carter signed a treaty giving this canal back, giving it to the Panamanians in the year 2000. And the Iranian hostage crisis, this is the one where they stormed the embassy and held the hostages for 444 days, but because they wanted the Shah of Iran to be returned. They were released on January 20th, 1981, the day Reagan was inaugurated, the day Mrs. Francis went to the inauguration, and the day that Miss Canone was born. All right, and now I'll just quickly go through each decade. 50s is your age of conformity, kind of these expectations that people should all live similar lives. You're seeing the growth of the suburbs with Levittown being developed. William J. Levitt, I don't think his middle name was J. William Levitt built these mass-produced homes on Long Island and made it very affordable for people to live. The growth of the Sun Belt, that's this region from Florida all the way to California in the south, where many people were moving for the weather and for lower taxes. The GI Bill, we awarded money for college and down payments for homes for our soldiers when they were returning from World War II. Rock and roll is prevalent during the 50s. That was a term coined by a Cleveland DJ. That's where the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is. Elvis Presley, to show you the conservative nature of the time period. They would not even show him shaking his hips on TV. And in I Love Lucy, they wouldn't allow Lucy and her husband to be shown in the same bed. They actually had twin beds. The 60s is a far more radical, liberal decade. And the best example of that is LBJ's Great Society, which was Medicare and Medicaid, Head Start, early childhood education, more government. He also called for a war on poverty after the release of the book The Other America by Michael Harrington. So they're going to like to see connections on the exam. So the progressive era of the early 1900s, the New Deal of the 1930s, and now the Great Society are all examples of more government involvement. Vietnam War is during the 60s. This is a decade of assassinations. JFK in 63, Malcolm X in 65, Martin Luther King in 68, and then Bobby Kennedy in 1968 as well. Gay rights movement is often viewed as beginning in 1969 with the Stonewall riots, and Also, I reviewed women yesterday, but there is a second wave of feminism that begins in the 60s with the book The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan, in which she argues that women are not happy. They're trapped at home in the 50s. Everything looks good on the surface, but inside they're very upset as they're taking a step backward. Much more radicalized decade, the 60s. Again, the convention. Woodstock, kind of like the counterculture movement, and the Beatles during the 60s. And then we go to the 70s, Nixon, Ford, and Carter. It's a very tumultuous time in American history. There's still these groups that are fighting for equality. There's also a more conservative backlash against the radicalism of the 60s. Nixon, this is always good to know, Nixon really referred to there being a silent majority behind what we watch on TV with your hippies and the protesters. You'll see the environmentalist movement begin to take shape also in the 70s. I think the Watergate scandal is a defining moment politically because under Nixon, people are now losing faith in the government, and you also see more radicalism as well, especially at the end of the decade. Disco is during the 70s, and remember the oil crisis and the gas lines. So I'm just trying to go through this quickly. I know we're running out of time, but I hope everybody is doing well. Hope that gives you a little bit of an overview of this time period, and I will see you again.